Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to another lecture in our VOX-Pol seminar series for 2023. I'm Dr. Julian Drugan. Today we have Dr. Rohit Chopra with us. Dr. Chopra is a professor of communications at Santa Clara University in the United States. His research centers on global Hindu right-wing extremist communities and networks, with a focus on how these groups mobilize through online digital platforms and spaces. Today, Dr. Chopra will be presenting on online Hindu extremism, its local, national, and global dimensions. Dr. Chopra, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. We're all very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Drugan. It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be able to make this presentation, and thanks very much to Dr. Drugan and everyone at VOX-Pol as well for your interest and the very kind introduction. So I can go ahead and share my screen, I assume, and let me just see more share screen. Sorry, just give me 1 second. This should show up now. There we go. All right, and there we are. Okay, so the presentation, as Dr. Drugan said, is titled Online Hindu Extremism, Local, National and Global Dimensions. And let me just start with a definition. I'll come to Hindu extremism in a minute, but let me start with two other terms which are fundamentally related to Hindu extremism. So as we speak, Hindu nationalism, or what is also called Hindutva, which literally translates into Hinduness, is now the de facto dominant ideology of present-day India. And in a nutshell, Hindutva or Hindu nationalism essentially says that Hindus are the true authentic citizens of the Indian nation. India is a Hindu nation in this sense, and minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians, are outsiders. The claim here, the fundamental claim, is one of cultural sovereignty. And from that claim of cultural sovereignty, political implications and other implications flow. So even if India is a constitutional secular republic, the argument is at its core, in its essence, India is Hindu. It's rooted in 19th century Hindu reform movements, which were inspired by European ethno-nationalist movements. And it consists of a network of Hindu organizations, the chief among which is something called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, which was founded in 1925. And the term Hindutva itself was popularized by V.D. Savarkar. It wasn't coined by him, but he articulated the idea of India as a Hindu nation in a 1923 text. So the entire sort of corpus of Hindu right organizations basically is dedicated to this idea. So it's a grand project, 100 years in the making. The RSS has about 57,000 branches all over India, decades-long initiative of spreading its ideology through social services, education, training camps, propaganda. It also has an extensive overseas presence with its overseas wing called the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, having 3,000 branches in over 150 countries, and now recently in places like Taiwan, Korea. And these branches are sort of autonomous, yet all of them are connected. Now, after Dr. Drugan kindly invited me to make this presentation, I was thinking about the term Hindu extremism, and it's actually a very useful and valid term for the violence of different kinds that is committed by the Hindu right. And I think increasingly scholars should use terms like Hindu extremism and Hindu racism as well, which may seem like a bit of a contradiction. Because Hinduism denotes a religion, but overseas especially, it functions like an ethnic cultural category. But Hindu extremism captures the fact that violent actions are committed by a range of people who identify as Hindus, they act in the name of Hinduism, and they target those that they see as enemies of Hinduism. And they include core members of Hindu right organizations, a broader group with sympathy to the cause, and others, including subaltern groups like Dalits, who at times strategically ally with the cause. So, I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that Hindu extremism has really been on the rise since Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, uh, came to power on the back of a sweeping victory for the BJP in 2014. Um, and since then, what's happened is that the organs of the Indian state have fused effectively with the BJP in a manner that recalls in some ways what happened in Nazi Germany. The mainstream media has been weaponized, and coming to the topic of this conversation, the internet has really been central to this kind of process. So there are online mobs which are overseen by the BJP's information technology cell, and the BJP is the political wing of the Hindu right, the Bharatiya Janata Party. It's the party that Mr. Modi helms. Trolls are a weapon. WhatsApp groups are a weapon. And what we see is an economy of violence which includes banal, routine forms of violence and humiliation against Muslims, particularly, but other minorities uh, as well as public forms of spectacular violence such as riots and lynching. And the internet plays a kind of fairly important role in this, both in whipping up the frenzies that lead to this violence, but also afterwards in being a platform where these clips, these messages are kind of circulated, right? And they amplify the power of the right. So, just this week, in fact, just a couple of days ago, there's been an excellent story, couple of stories in the Washington Post from a theme, and the theme is called Rising India Toxic Tech. And they really deal with, when they say tech, they are talking really about online technology spaces and platforms. And this is a wonderful detailed story about a vast digital campaign by Hindu nationalists to inflame India. It's a 10-year project using WhatsApp groups. There's one about cow vigilante. The cow is sacred to Hindus, and cow protection, self-appointed cow protection groups, in the name of attacking alleged cow smugglers, have really been wreaking the worst kind of violence on Muslim communities, often lynching innocent people or beating them up and so on. And this is someone who has been live streaming his attacks. And the other part of the headline, YouTube gave him an award, also gives us an inkling of the complicity of the tech channels, which is something I can come to in a little bit. So, uh, sorry, we know that this violence is pervasive, and just a month before India hosted the G20 summit, India was, I think, the Indians were we were the president of the summit, or the Indian state was in charge of it. It sort of rotates. There were these religious riots, and again, the internet was played a central role in them. And I just want to share something that was circulating extensively on social media forums in 2022 December. There was a judgment on some bomb blasts in 2008, and the suspects who were convicted were Muslim. And this was an image that was circulating, and it was taken straight from something from the Nazi playbook, right, depicting enemies of the Nazis. So the larger question, which a number of organizations and others have raised, is India even a democracy anymore? And a number of civil society organizations in the West particularly have said that no, India is not a democracy. So we are in a human and minority rights crisis where India resembles a fascist state. Just 2 days ago, a number of journalists who have YouTube channels, which are becoming very popular, who are critics of the government, they've been raided on grounds of being anti-national, and they risk being putting into jail on on the basis of anti-terror law, which can imprison people, on the basis of which people can be imprisoned for years without bail. Narendra Modi, who is the prime minister of India, has been sort of central to leading this process of resurgence. Um, Now, very briefly, another minute or two, I want to just signal some things about the Hindu right before talking about media, and specifically like online media. So the Hindu right starts, essentially coming back into the mainstream slowly in the 80s. And Narendra Modi was the chief minister of an Indian state called Gujarat. Um, and he was denied a visa after a role in, allegedly for the role he played in an anti Muslim genocide in 2002. Uh, so he was politically marginalized. He was possibly could have gone to prison, but he kind of wriggled out of that. Became an international pariah, but branded himself as a Hindu savior, moved to the right, And this sort of set in place a template for Muslim disenfranchisement. And what happens is that slowly, starting in the late 80s, I want to say, media, the sort of mainstream media, English language media particularly, which generally was secular, right? It starts, showing more religious, especially more Hindu, overtly branded Hindu content. But you also have other sort of media economies like cassette tapes circulating in North Indian states, which, have these recordings of imagined, literally sort of faked recordings of Hindu victims of Muslim atrocities screaming. And you would have cars and trucks sort of driving through the streets, essentially blaring these. So, since the 1990s, when India's economy liberalized, there's been an explosive growth of TV channels. They've become more jingoistic, sensationalistic. Hindu themes have become much more predominant. Modi starts a PR blitz. And then starting, slowly, like he gets known as this effective, very effective, like person who can do things, right? And the violence that he was guilty of, or allegedly guilty of, in some cases, it is ignored when liberals, former liberals, or liberal, self-avowed liberals embrace him. And in some cases, he kind of plays it up to his base. And the internet, right, which really takes off in India after the invention of the World Wide Web, as it does everywhere, since the 1990s, it has been a key platform for the Hindu right. So I want to say the mid to late 90s. And I used to work in the Indian internet industry. I worked for a startup, India's first major portal and startup, Rediff, for 2 years. And I started noticing this audience for this right wing content. And the portal I worked for also, in some ways, contributed to creating this kind of right wing economy by platforming journalists with extreme right wing views who, and it had others from across the spectrum, but some of the voices it platformed were people who would not have got a column because of their politics. They were just considered beyond the pale. It's not that they were sort of anti right as such, but these people were extremists. And the internet links the diaspora and Indians in India. And from the sort of very onset, the Hindu right and the BJP were very, very active in mobilizing the internet, both domestically, but also to build links with the diaspora as compared to the Congress party. So, uh, I generally just want to very briefly mention that Indian society itself, starting around 2010, have shifted towards supporting Mr. Modi, both in the name of development or globalizing India, making India a world power, and so on and so forth. And this includes both the professional middle classes, the industrial classes, and the sort of industrial elites, but also subaltern groups. Coming to the internet, and from here on, the presentation will, I'm going to sort of focus significantly just on the role of the internet. So, from around 2011, the Hindu right, the BJP, but the Hindu right more broadly, begins a very, very effective campaign to mobilize the internet for a mass middle class movement through different kinds of proxies. And they use, think tanks. It's a kind of American style model. There's a whole number of these foundations that are revived, something called the Vivekananda Foundation, then the India Foundation. And the target ostensibly is the ruling Congress party. They use popular political figures, they use celebrities. But in India at this point of time, from you have a Congress-led government in power, and for better or for worse, whether it is sort of hypocritical or not genuine, uh, the sort of public self-image or the image self-image of the Indian state is one of a secular republic. And it is still something that people, even if perhaps its legitimacy is fraying, pay lip service to at least. So with the 2014 election still away, and the Congress wins in 1999, the 99 elections. With the elections still a while away, uh, Hindu nationalism and the Congress in power, and this is the second of two terms when a Congress-led coalition was in power, called the UPA, the United Progressive Alliance. Um, so it's still secularism, which is kind of the dominant official ideology of the party in power, and it is of the Indian state too. So Hindu nationalism is still politically at this point of time a toxic term, Hindu nationalism and Hindutva. So what the Hindu right focuses on really is eradicating corruption. And there is this mass movement in about 2012, which captured the imagination of the world, called the India Against Corruption movement, and it mobilized internet and mobile technologies very, very effectively. It pointed to certain scams, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about any of those. And it pointed to those scams as proof of this massive kind of corruption that the Congress was engaging in. And these cases were later on dismissed by courts as completely sort of bogus. So around this time, what happens is you also have the basis for online Hindu extremism being set under the cover of these anti corruption movements. And what this movement feeds off, what it's able to use is a massive presence of Hindu and Hindu nationalist websites that have been around since the 1990s. And many of these websites are based in Silicon Valley. They're run by expatriate Indians who work in technology and other sectors. So some of these websites are, you could say that they are sort of Hindu nationalist by omission, in the sense that there's a massive amount of Hindu-related content, which is not overtly targeting Muslims, but there is no mention of Islam or Christianity in any of the content on India, not just on Hinduism, right? They will treat Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism as Indian religions, but they don't even acknowledge that Islam and Christianity are Hindu religions. Sorry, are Indian religions. Pardon me. And some of them are, outright sort of just uh, demonizing Muslims, attacking Muslims, just completely sort of bigoted hate speech. Uh, so this has been around this backdrop of Hindu right websites. They've been around for like quite a long time. Uh, and I want to signal here that you find very few websites dedicated as such to any kind of inclusive idea of Indianness, all the values of India or of Indian society that, in a somewhat exceptionalist narrative and to some extent romanticized, but had been seen as the qualities that are seen as essential to India, its syncretic culture, its secular culture, its pluralism. It's not like either the Congress or civil society groups or just ordinary citizens or expatriates are really maintaining websites dedicated to any of these issues. The only websites that talk about Indian identity tend to be, either the soft Hindutva, soft Hindu nationalist, or the more overtly extremist websites. And in 2012, there's an online platform called Niti Central, which is actually created with the deliberate goal of creating a Hindu right online media ecosystem. And the belief is that the televisual media, the print media, the mainstream media is all, in the name of being secular, it is sort of anti Hindu. There is no right wing presence as such. But I should mention here that Niti Central, the person who sort of set it up, I happened to meet him when I was doing research for my book on the virtual Hindu Rashtra, which means the virtual Hindu nation, a few years ago. He's an entrepreneur. He was India's first internet millionaire. He was motivated more by creating a right wing space for in economic terms that would be more sort of libertarian, dedicated to freedom of speech. It would also like advocate economic reform, less government regulation, and so on. His name is Rajesh Jain. And I think he thought that Modi's cultural nationalism, sorry, was just kind of window dressing, and it was not something very dangerous. Later on, I know that he's been completely appalled by what the Hindu right turned out to be. But the BJP also started cultivating an army of volunteers, and the sort of term for Modi devotees, because they're supposed to be like followers of a cult, is Modi Bhakts, right? Modi fans. Bhakt means devotee. So the BJP started social media seminars, and they literally had farms of trolls. I'd say 2012 onwards, who would send out these mass sort of attacks, waves of messages. I have a friend who said that if he was invited to speak on a topic on a television channel, and if there was something that he said which he was not being pro BJP, but it converged with their agenda as an opposition party, there would be thousands of messages of support on Twitter. And conversely, if there was something that went against what the BJP was advocating, there would be lots of nasty messages. At this time, simultaneously, some voices in the mainstream media also start, and they are, obviously there are some kind of arrangements at work with the BJP. They start taking on this kind of pro BJP, we need a strong Hindu leader, the Congress is weak kind of rhetoric. So this is an initial phase of weaponizing Facebook or Meta and Twitter and X for misinformation and propaganda. So the idea here is essentially that we want to hound out critics on social media with an attempt to dominate and colonize the social media space. This has kind of been the long-term goal. And after 2014, what we see happening is that while in the sort of larger social space in India, you just once Modi became prime minister, it was kind of open season on Muslims. The Hindu right groups, violent or extremist groups took it as kind of license to attack Muslims, humiliate them, abuse them. And the same thing starts happening online. It's not just minorities, but it's also critics of the government, it's opposition leaders, and you just find the vilest kind of uh, abuse just pouring out, and it's absolutely relentless and it's non-stop. The big tech platforms in India, as elsewhere in the world, have played a really sort of negative role in this. We know that I think Facebook was fined for its role in fomenting a genocide in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, and in the Indian context, they followed a really nasty double standard. They allowed countless Hindu extremist accounts to issue assault, rape, death threats without penalty, while shutting down critics of the government. And the BJP's IT cell chief, Amit Malviya, he's very well known as a serial sort of fake news spreader. But the moment, if Twitter even flagged one of his accounts as, one of his tweets as being fake news, there was immediate retaliation. Every time the accounts pushed the tech platforms, pardon me, pushed back a little, they were hounded, they were harassed. I know that at some point of time, WhatsApp's head had to fly down to India. Few years ago, I think this was towards the end of Modi's first term or maybe in the second term, the managing director of Twitter India had to actually be flown out because there was a case booked against him. So the government made it very clear that if Twitter, Facebook, Google also to some extent didn't do their bidding, they would come after them. And something that caught the attention of the world really is how Mr. Modi's himself followed some of these terrible, terrible accounts, like people literally issuing rape and death threats. So uh, we also had, sorry, I just want to make sure that I didn't miss a clip. Okay, yes. So I'll come to some of those articles in a minute, but then continuing, you also get these spectacularly violent, this kind of circuit of spectacular violence, right? Of circulation of these images, clips showing minorities being assaulted and lynched in the name of the nation, circulating widely on social media. And 2019, by the time we come to 2019, the sort of, cat is out of the bag, the pretense is done away with. The 2019 election is openly fought on Hindu nationalism, right? And on a kind of very ugly anti-minority sentiment. So we can say, again, linking it to the theme of extremism, that these extremist sentiments become completely normalized and routine by this point of time. And endorsing and participating in violence against minorities, especially the Muslim enemy, becomes a mark of authentic Indian identity. And again, the internet is absolutely central to this project. And these mobile technologies, we know they allow for really a kind of pornographic violence to be recorded and circulated. And I find it, very, very hard to see any of these things, these images, I mean, these videos. Arguably, there is some value they serve because once they circulate, then, even the police, which are compromised and complicit in much of this violence, they have no option but to act. India has to keep up some pretense, at least in the eye of the world or for its citizens. But it's very, very hard to watch otherwise because it's just sort of reliving this violence. And I just want to share here, some. There's been a lot of coverage of the online Hindu extremism in the Western press over the last 5-6 years. These are some, screenshots of some stories. Not what Mr. Modi is tweeting, but what he's reading. He really follows like the worst people. Um, this, fake news, which is a lot of the fake news is news that is either about atrocities, non-existent atrocities which have been committed by Muslims, or these are actually calls for violence in a sense that Hindus should rise, just a kind of dog whistling. 18,000 Twitter accounts spreading fake news for the BJP, and just a fraction of those, really tiny fraction, for the Congress party. And I think the number is much larger. The BJP IT cell tweet, the head, he writes, either accuses Rahul Gandhi of, who's the sort of head of the Congress party, of or was the head of the Congress party till recently, of again committing sort of vile crimes which he never has, or just is directly abusive to him. And if Twitter, let alone canceling the account, if it even flags it, there's pushback. So Mr. Modi continues to follow hate mongers. So it's kind of been, a constant. So let me just delve a little bit into specifically, how these uh, different online platforms have been weaponized, and what are some of the forms that online extremism has taken. So the 2014 general election in India, where the BJP came to power very convincingly, was termed the Facebook election, and given its role in influencing the election to the BJP's advantage. Uh, but the 2019 election, in comparison, was called the WhatsApp election. And WhatsApp is a much more powerful tool in India as it is in Brazil than, for instance, it might be in the US. So it played a similar role, but it played a much more dangerous role. And a part of that, I think, and we can talk about this a little more in the question answer session too, is to do with the nature of like WhatsApp. Because yes, Facebook groups are private, Facebook groups are also closed. But WhatsApp as a social network is a sort of internal communication network, right? It's semi-open, you can say. So it's the source of rumors, and you have, you know, tens of thousands of WhatsApp groups, and you have all kinds of rumors. So it's not just to do with the Hindu right, I should mention. There have been these, rumors, and nobody knows who starts them, and nobody knows why they're started. And sometimes it's just complete nonsense, which inconveniences people. Like today, the water supply is going to be shut off for like 10 hours, so people will panic. But there were these rumors about, child abductors, which led to actually the death, the lynching of some people. But you have these rumors about this group of Muslims who are cow smugglers are traveling on this highway or freeway, and then you will have a vigilante group that will go up there. Um, so what happened is in the first term of Mr. Modi, there were a number of policy failures also. And many of his alleged strokes of genius didn't really pan out to be these master strokes, like a policy of uh, retiring currency, which is called demonetization. So there was an incentive to move sort of completely towards Hindutva, anyways, but that was a kind of natural progression, anyways. And I think he made it okay to express sentiments that for decades had not been okay to espouse publicly, even if perhaps unfortunately or tragically a large section of the Indian population, the Hindu population, held those kinds of views. Um, but he realized that, and the BJP realized that Hindutva and the jingoistic nationalism aided by the internet could do the trick, and it did. So there's a WhatsApp misinformation malaise. India has 400 million WhatsApp users, or had, I think, a few months ago. The number's probably higher, compared to 290 million Facebook users. So that's staggering. That's, we more than a third of the Indian population. And it's decentralized, it's encrypted. And what it does is it provides the BJP and the Hindu right a kind of structure of deniability. And I'll talk a little more about this, but one of the things I want to just mention here is that, I've been studying the Hindu right online and online Hindu extremism for, I want to say, 15, 17, more than that, 20 years actually. It's grad school. And I've been seeing them for like 25 years, literally, exactly this year, because in 1998, I joined this portal, rediff.com, and it's precisely because I saw this Hindu right wing sentiment. I was very intrigued by it, and I wanted to get back to grad school, and I said, this is what I'm going to study. Now, I want to say till about even maybe 8, 10, 12 years ago, it's possible to talk about, the Indian internet or the Hindu right internet or online extremism, and we can still make meaningful generalizations, as I hope, the arguments I've presented are. But at this point of time, the use of each of these platforms has become sophisticated enough to the point that, we are ready for granular studies of how exactly the Hindu right uses Facebook or Meta, how it uses Twitter, how it uses WhatsApp. And there's been some work coming out on that. But I think it would be great to have, like, I think the next generation of scholars or future directions of scholarship should focus on extremism in each of these platforms, because that's how sophisticated the use of the BJP is. So I know some people and who have access to the BJP IT cell, or or the apparatus of the BJP, and they said that the BJP's IT cell and other groups, they engage allegedly in A/B testing to see which WhatsApp fake messages will play better. Twitter has a much smaller reach, but its significance is related to the politics of visibility. The mainstream media actually has an anxiety about Twitter. So if there's something on Twitter, you will actually see televisual media, and I shouldn't say mainstream media, maybe legacy media, you'll actually see them feature those tweets. So this also pushes the sort of televisual media to be as extreme as Twitter, or as extreme as something that a random troll or a hate monger on Twitter is saying, and dominating Twitter discourse, being it's part of the whole sort of circus of Mr. Modi's ego, right? The world's most popular leader, the leader with the greatest approval, etc. So having a large number of followers, having celebrities wish him. I mean, the BJP will literally hound people and harass people, celebrities, Bollywood actors, cricketers, scientists, and other prominent Indians if they don't wish Mr. Modi on his birthday, or if they don't, praise the inauguration of the new parliament, or praise. You have bizarre situations where cricketers were praising economic policies and so on. And every platform is used for dog whistling by the Hindu right. Now, one problem here, I had worked on with a non-profit on a project which, much of it we could not actually eventually share because of risks to some of the researchers in the ground, on how Facebook was being used by the Hindu right in the Indian northeastern state of Assam, which had a citizens register to keep out outsiders apparently, but it de facto became a way of disenfranchising the Muslim population in that state. And one of the things that we found was content on Facebook by the Hindu right would often use local offensive terms. And there was no way that the algorithms, right, that Facebook was using could pick up those offensive terms. I mean, Facebook was guilty in any case of a lot of not acting on a lot of things, even when things had been flagged. But there was just no way it could do that. Neither like a team or, Facebook actually has this bizarre kind of PowerPoint about which it gives teams on how to identify fake, hateful messages. But that would just not make any sense. It would not make any sense anyways in India for a number of reasons, but there is no way it would pick that up. How do you do that for a country where there are 26 major languages, 600 languages otherwise in the broad sense of the word, so many communities, so many dialects, the possibility of so much coding, so many local histories. So when they are picked up, the
Rohit,
platform.
just a quick message that you've hit the half-hour point.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I'll be wrapping up in 10 minutes. Thanks, Julian. So they when the when they are picked up, the platforms, they just turn a blind eye. Okay. Now let me talk a little bit, moving towards the last 8-9 minutes of the presentation, about the local, national, and global connections and how they work together. So WhatsApp groups, I would say, uh, they are used in a sense most effectively, well, perhaps most dangerously, for hyperlocal objectives. Rumors of cow smugglers in a particular town in the state of Haryana or UP. Cow protection vigilantes also have their own WhatsApp groups, and they use these to target alleged smugglers, right? Or to accuse someone. And sometimes, you don't know, as with riots, it could just be a vendetta and against someone who's a Muslim, or you just want to take someone who's a Muslim, you want to take their property. So you call them a cow smuggler, right? And next thing you know, there's a mob on its way. So that's why sometimes the local bureaucrat has to actually shut down internet communication. And one of the things that sometimes frustrates me is that the way this plays out in the West is, if this happens, is, oh, well, India is resorting to, censorship again. And India does resort to censorship. It's had the largest number of internet shutdowns. But sometimes this is literally the only thing a bureaucrat has at their disposal to stop that mob. Residential housing societies have these WhatsApp groups, and the junk that circulates on them is absolutely appalling. It's absolute hate filled messages. Diasporic groups have their WhatsApp networks, and information, does flow back and forth across national borders. And then there are some, transnational groups like people's school groups and all. And I've had a number of friends talk about how they're appalled that the people they went to school with, the people they went to college with, circulate this kind of nonsense. Uh, Numerous Hindu right organizations, which are very small or medium sized, not the huge big ones, have Facebook pages. Some of these are regional groups, like a group called the Sanathan Sanstha, And Billy Perigo, a journalist from Time, had a story about how Facebook banned. It's a very extremist group, functions out of the Western Indian state of Goa. Facebook banned it, but its pages were online for like months later, right? It was technically banned. So these are semi-closed spaces, but they incubate anti-minority sentiments and tropes that then sort of percolate into national economies of information. So this is again, some coverage, uh, and violent cow protection was itself like the theme of a major story by report by Human Rights Watch, and then there was Wired magazine had a piece on how these cow vigilantes are actually using WhatsApp. Right, WhatsApp is really their kind of weapon of choice. So cow vigilantism is not new in India. It predates the internet, it predates the Modi era, but it's taken on a kind of new ominous form. Um, Online networks also are used, to whip up national level controversies and to create an imagined community of Hindu victims against Muslims or against devious foreign networks allegedly out to attack Hinduism, the BJP, or Mr. Modi, which are all conflated with India. They are used for targeting and doxing activists, journalists, and others by calling them anti-national, placing them at risk. So in 2020, there were rumors that Muslim Indians were deliberately spreading the coronavirus, through a strategy of what was, in a horrible term called Corona Jihad, that they were spitting and trying to infect everyone. And there was a gathering of, I think, Bohri Muslims, or Dawoodi Bohra Muslims, perhaps it was a Shia Muslim sect in Delhi, and they were targeted, as the idea was that this is deliberately done to infect large numbers of Hindus and Indians at large with coronavirus. And again, just this week, independent journalists who have their own YouTube channels, critics of the government, have been raided on grounds of using Chinese money to engage in anti-national propaganda. And in the lead up to this, based on something in a New York Times story, again, you had online spaces, going on and on about how they're anti-national. So this is a kind of, national community being created against the imagined Muslim mother. Activists and journalists, I've named a few, have been targeted by BJP IT cell and trolls. And a few people, they had this software, Pegasus, which is made by an Israeli software company, the spyware installed on their phones as well. Globally, especially in the US, UK, and increasingly in Australia, the Hindu right tends to focus on similar issues, and they employ similar extremist tactics. Here, in each overseas context, the goal is to control the representation of Hinduism. They target academics, and more recently, they've started attacking Muslim community spaces and mosques. So it's become more extremist. The extremism was academics were a particular target because of the authority academics had. And the idea was that the Hindu community should determine what should be taught about Hinduism and who can say what where. But now it's moved to actual physical attacks too, especially in New Jersey, one of the bastions of the Hindu right. And some of these projects are specific to each society. For instance, the Hindu extremist and far right group, the Hindu American Foundation, opposes caste equity initiatives in the US. So they claim to be independent, all of these organizations, but there are deep links with the Hindu right in India, and there are massive sums of money flowing both ways, actually. So during COVID-19 funds meant for COVID-19 relief were diverted by the Hindu American Foundation to Hindu right projects in India. And a journalist, Rakib Hamid Nayak, who wrote a story about it for Al Jazeera, was sued. Half lost the case, but they don't want any attention on this. So this has also got some attention in the press. And this is a very useful and fantastic study about Hindu nationalist influence in the US, which talks about how I think something like $60 million or something, some staggering sum of money has flowed from the US to India over the last 7-8 years. Now, there are some initiatives which are very deliberately and clearly organized as global initiatives also. So that's another respect in which this is a global this is a global kind of phenomenon, online extremism. And the best example I can give you is a conference called the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, which was held in 2021. And it was targeted by Hindu far right groups in the US even as soon as it was announced, which was, the organizers were cautious to wait till just a couple of weeks before, by media organizations in India, including the, mainstream televisual media, Prominent pro-government voices were online, the BJP IT cell, and thousands of trolls and anonymous accounts. And I, as by way of disclosure, I was an organizer for the event and I was in charge of media relations. And to give you a sense, this was organized by over 70 centers in 50 universities, mostly in America, but some in other parts of the world. 1 million emails were sent in protest, and so much so that one university received something like 30,000 emails in a minute, Drew University, and its server crashed. And there were participants who received rape and death threats, with women and caste and religious minorities receiving the worst, and many had to withdraw. And the doxing and abuse continued in all kinds of ways well after the conference, and I can talk a little bit about, those tactics as well. So while there are voices and spaces online where alternate conceptions of Indian and Hindu identity are presented, they simply can't compete with the scale of online Hindu extremism, which now very clearly should be seen as a state-backed project. The opposition parties in India, which stand allegedly, supposedly for secularism or pluralism, although they also peddle a kind of soft version of Hindu nationalism at times, they've not been able to mobilize the internet. And civil society is weak, it's been weakened more, and while there is awareness globally, the tech firms, they're unwilling to do much. International civil society's reach and interest in India is limited. And now, because of, support for India to counter China, powerful nations like the US will not do much. And I think I'll just end on that note. Finally, just, the fact also remains that at this point, it's also become global in the way in which these online Hindu extremism is both inspiring as well as feeding off some other online right-wing movements, and I can talk more about that in the question and answer session. But yeah, that concludes my presentation. So thanks once again, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Well, look, thank you, Rohit, very much for an excellent presentation. There's lots of places we can jump off from with questions. The first question I'd like to ask is to take up your point around some of the large social media companies, particularly Facebook and WhatsApp. Have you seen a trend towards growing awareness within these companies of the role that their platforms are playing in this phenomenon in India and elsewhere? Also, have you seen any growth in capacity for these companies to deal with, say, the complexities of local languages and vernaculars in India and identifying things such as hate speech in regional areas?
Yeah. So, excellent question. Awareness, yes, there is a good deal of awareness among a large number of people in Facebook. Now, Facebook, Google. Now, a lot of these tech companies, or most of the tech companies, they have significant Indian origin employees in the US. So I think one thing to sort of remember is, or one thing to keep in mind is, at the end of the day, the power centers are here, right? You can have some influential people, but it's what happens in Facebook in Silicon Valley, or Meta in Silicon Valley, or Google in Silicon Valley, that I think drives a lot of things. So you've had a section of, I'd say, Indian origin, first, second generation Indians, a number of, Indians who moved here over the last, I would say, 10, 15, 20 years, who have tried to raise attention, bring awareness to this issue. And they have also managed to get the attention of other non-Indians who are working in these companies. And they have large numbers of people who are very genuinely committed, I think, to questions about human rights and being on the right side of things and not promoting hate speech. But so that's definitely a case. And then, there are other voices within these companies that tend to be pro-Hindu, right, also among sort of Hindu and Indian populations. But I think ultimately it's just, the larger sort of political economy of tech, and then the sort of desire to basically have this prominent presence in the Indian market just becomes a kind of, natural limit to what can be done. Because the Facebook's, and I don't know about Twitter so much. Twitter has a significant user base in India, but Facebook's largest market, or largest sort of user base, is India, I think, right now. And digital is it's very hard to monetize digital, but I think Facebook, in the long run, medium and long run, India will be a major profit center, because WhatsApp, for instance, is used for everything. Everyone uses WhatsApp. Your milkman uses WhatsApp. The person who delivers your bread uses WhatsApp, right? So your FedEx guy uses WhatsApp. So that's, I think, a kind of, it's the profit motive kind of sets a natural limit. But at high levels as well, people are very concerned, and I think they are genuinely trying to do what they can, but they're limited by the government in India, and the government is, it's the worst offender. I mean, just to be blunt. But on the what it does is, you have to admire their chutzpah. That on the one hand they're the worst offender, on the other hand they will turn around and poker face. They will blame the platforms for spreading hate, and then they will punish them or raid them or threaten to raid them or impose some kind of fine, saying that they're not complying with Indian regulations. I know Facebook has this oversight board, and I was through Santa Clara University, not through Santa Clara University, my apologies, but through another group that I'm part of, with regard to the question of casteist hate speech, right, which was casteist, discriminatory speech against Dalit minorities, caste minorities. I went through a conversation with some of the members of their oversight board, and I think they're genuinely well intentioned, but I just think the entity is so large that, to me, what they need to do is like 50 times what they're doing. You need comprehensive, you need to really, really invest in really like local language experts, right? And then you need that larger environment in India where these experts are allowed to flag hate speech. But if they're allowed to do that, they will run afoul of the local BJP in every language, and local politicians, and then that will come with consequences.
Can I ask a question about the broader context of the far right? So the far right in the West, online, often have an Orientalist obsession with the East and the origins of Nazism and even India and Hinduism and so on, particularly the occult fringe of the far right online. Do you
Right.
see any connections between these online Hindutva movements and far right extremists in the West? Connections online, online networks, or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. It's a wonderful question, and it's something that deserved a slide of its own. So I'm really grateful to you for raising that. So yes, so there are connections at, I'd say, the thematic and the ideological level, and then there are practical connections, and now there are connections in terms of even strategies being used, and inspiration flowing both ways. So first, what's very interesting is that Hindutva itself one can make a very persuasive case for it being an Orientalist, to some extent, an Orientalist version of Hinduism, right? And some of the claims made are completely this idea of mystics, Hindu spirituality, and so on. And for some reason, it's ironic, but for some reason, or maybe it's not that surprising, given that it has had these complicated kind of it's a sort of mirror image of Western conceptions of Hinduism in at least two ways. One, the Orientalism, which you pointed out, and second, it's inspired by European 19th century ethno-nationalist movements. So perhaps for both those reasons, getting the approval of the West is sort of very, very important to Hindu nationalists. And whether it's Mr. Modi or it's your, garden variety Hindu nationalist troll, if the West criticizes them, they're very sensitive. And if a Western society praises some aspect of Hindutva, or Hinduism, Hindutva is a very peace-loving ideology, they're absolutely sort of thrilled and delighted. But you find all the obscurantism, sort of bits of theosophy, mysticism, figures like Sadhguru, who's this god man who has comes up with these absurd concepts like inner engineering and delivers you know lectures to packed audiences in Silicon Valley, including Silicon Valley CEOs. I mean, he's your classic Orientalist godman. So he plays into that, and then there's a sort of the occult sort of fringe. Is one audience, but I think also the sort of general stereotypical image of India also contributes a little bit. The second aspect in which is that increasingly these movements, when it comes to violence, they borrow tactics from each other. Breivik, who was the Norwegian mass killer, was inspired by Hindu nationalist discourse. The Hindu nationalists in India have been huge fans of Trump and the American far right. And the internet again is central to that kind of extremism. I mean, there's some of these organizations that would have actually cardboard cutouts of Mr. Trump and feed him cake. Uh, and then a lot of the themes of the Hindu far right are actually borrowed form increasingly, or they've become part of a globalized discourse. So, ideas, for instance, of the deep state, which is a term first used in the Turkish context, but you find that in MAGA, American right wing discourse, it's now in India. COVID conspiracy theories in India, Right. Recently, an Indian businessman, Adani, was, accused of major sort of manipulation and lost a lot of money. His companies, their shell companies, accused of round tripping money. And it was completely, the accusations were that this was a conspiracy at the base of which Soros was there, right? So anti Semitic tropes, which have not historically had much purchase in India. And then, there's a right wing rag called Op India, which is a propaganda outfit funded allegedly by the BJP government. They do the worst of the worst. The editor actually met a far right, British right wing white nationalist, and and the sort of common enemy there is the Muslim figure. So they were, and this was in the wake of some Hindu Muslim clashes in Leicester, which were provoked by the Hindu right. And it was all about, oh, it's misunderstood. The American or the British right, the white nationalists are misunderstood. So Christian nationalism and Hindu nationalism has much in common. And one of the people running for president, Vivek Ramaswamy, is trying to actually play to that, both that evangelical base, but also the sort of white right. So that's an excellent question. Thank you.
I want to ask a question about violence. So, what's the likelihood of terrorist style violence emanating from this online movement, either within India or amongst the diaspora more globally? Do you see any likelihood of these sorts of occurrences in the future?
Yes, tragically, yes. I mean, we've had one, again, it was almost an American style event in something that, you know, you have mob violence, and mob violence we know is, and riots. Study after study in the Indian context has shown that riots don't, although they're reported as such, they don't occur spontaneously. They are produced, and they deliver clear electoral and political benefits for instigators. And this is true of rioters who might belong to the Congress, an allegedly secular party, as it is of the BJP. But there was an incident recently where a police constable shot two or three members of a Muslim family he was a railway constable, and he shouted like "Glory be to Modi" or something along those lines and killed them. So this is a classic case of that kind of radicalization. In the US also, I am very alarmed that it's just a matter of time. There was one case of a young man who was, I think a second generation Hindu American who was found with lots of white nationalist literature, and he was arrested before he was planning some kind of attack. But before that, there were also these incidents of a celebration of violence. In the Indian state of UP, the homes of Muslims have been bulldozed by the right wing, far right UP chief, at the base of the orders of the UP chief minister, Yogi Adityanath. And there was a parade taken out in a small town in New Jersey where the Hindu groups, the Hindu expatriate groups, or Hindu Americans or both, actually led a bulldozer as a way of, and it was a very ugly message that they wanted to send. The mayor of the town didn't know the context. When he found out, he was appalled and he shut it down. But there was also another incident, I think, in another town, of some men in a truck actually circling a kind of mosque, and I think they may have they entered the premises of the mosque, and they might have had guns, but they were, some kind of truck which had some semi-military vibe to it. So it's just a matter of time before, someone tips over. And in the US, again, we know, with all the problems of gun violence, uh, I think there is a real danger that some Hindu nationalist, it could be a second generation radicalized Hindu nationalist extremist, or it could be an expatriate who's come here in the last few years working in maybe, some industry, or who knows, or a student or something. But these student groups, there are Hindu extremist student groups also, and Hindu right wing groups like the Hindu Student Association. So the possibility is very much there, and it's a frightening thought.
Yeah, and to follow on from that a little, you've talked a lot about the diaspora and the role that diaspora in Silicon Valley, America, and other places play in the growth of online Hindu or Hindutva extremism. Um, Certainly, this is a threat to social cohesion in multicultural societies like Australia, Canada, United States, the UK. Increasingly so with this WhatsApp army of extremists being exported to some degree out of India and globally. What do you think national governments can do in countries like Australia and Canada, United States, to create counter movements to this creeping extremism? What sort of leverage do local governments have? What are the political implications when they're dealing with a country of strategic importance and diplomatic importance like India, which you mentioned at the end of your presentation? What room is there to move for local initiatives to try to dampen down some of this growing extremism abroad?
So it's interesting, all the countries that you mentioned. I mean, let's focus just on liberal democracies or Western liberal democracies. Uh, they all are countries which, domestically at least, all right, whatever the inconsistencies and hypocrisies they might be rightly accused of in how they act in the international sphere, domestically, these are countries that have strong institutions. They have a good rule of law. It's not perfect, but they genuinely score high on these metrics, right? There is sort of an belief in the constitution. There's a recourse to like a legal system. So my point always is that none of these governments would stand or would make concessions for white supremacist groups. And if they did, if there were figures in that government that did that, there are enough civil society resources, people that would hold them accountable for that, right? You crack down on white supremacist groups. Crack down on maybe Christian supremacist groups. So my hope would be that in the name of multiculturalism, right, they should not hesitate from acting against extremists who might be Hindu or who might be Muslim. And one of the things that happens with a category like Hindu, and perhaps to some extent with a category like Muslim as well, is, Hindu is sort of narrowly, strictly denotes a religion. But in the overseas context, and perhaps to some extent in India also, it's now beginning to function also as ethnicity, right? So someone might identify as Hindu without really necessarily, being a practicing Hindu or a believing Hindu, to the extent that something like that makes sense. What's one of the things the Hindu right, and including the extremist fringes of the Hindu right, and including people who engage in extremist actions, have been very smart about is they've been able to mobilize and weaponize this language of decolonization and of minority rights. So any criticism of Hinduism, no matter how legitimate, is seen as Hindu phobia. And I think governments which genuinely want to be seen as concerned about minority rights and multiculturalism and want to be inclusive sometimes are letting things go by, or they are sort of apprehensive or nervous about being seen as or being called racist. But so I think that's something that they have to hold very firm about. And I think not to be it's important that they don't follow a majority authority logic, by which I mean that there are other narratives of Indian identity. There are other narratives of Hindu identity. If you have the Hindu American Foundation, which is extremely well funded because it's a far right group and they raise money of these kinds of things, you also have inclusive groups like Hindus for Human Rights. So to take the effort to sort of do the work and to understand that there's a range of voices and there's a range of perspectives on Hinduism, and to not really let the most conservative, even if they're the most visible, sort of, or the most right wing or the most extremist groups, which often try to mask themselves as being very reasonable, kind of speak for Hinduism. And I think it's important because it's a matter of domestic security, it's a matter of national interest. And I think that's the point that needs to be made to a country like India, which is of increasing geopolitical significance to, the US, to UK, to Canada. There's this spat going on about the assassination of, the Sikh militant or terrorist Nijar as well, and Australia, which is that, what relationship we have with you should be separate from the fact that this is a problem. These are people who are engaging in hate speech, who are who threaten violence, who threaten the stability of Australian or American society. So we need to act as we would act against anyone, whether it's sort of Italian Americans or whether it's Muslim Americans or Jewish Americans or whoever. I think that's the point that needs to be made. Now, one of the things it's going to take is, I think, more effort, some investment, and really, like, just taking the effort to kind of learn a little bit more.
Well, Dr. Rohit Chopra, I can't thank you enough. And I think we've all learned a lot more from your presentation. It's a great pleasure to have you with us on the VOX-Pol network. Thank you once again. I'm sure many people will reach out to you with questions once this video goes live. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Drugan. I really appreciate it. And yes, people should just feel free. I would love to chat with anyone who has any questions. Thank you.